Okay, committee.
Committee, if you'd find your seats, and we'll give Mark and Jen a chance to collect themselves, and we'll reconvene.
Hello. Yeah. Okay. Did Dave give us one yesterday, or do I have to fill
4,
out
5, 6, 7.
Yeah, he did give us one. Yeah, you'll have to fill it out for him. What's the date today?
The
16th?
16th. No.
So we're back in session, and Mark's got some information he wants to pass out, and then when he's ready, he can start up.
And I'm just going to multitask, and it's probably very rude, but I'm going to try to get this all keyed up, and I don't want to waste your valuable time. So I think that the first section, Marc Pelka, again, Council of State Governments, Deputy Director of State Relations, and I'm here with my coworker, Jen Casella. And we were going through before the break the kind of 3 challenges identified through Justice Reinvestment. And the first was the challenges of supervision and programming meeting the level of need of your high risk to fail supervision population. The second section concerns ineffective and costly responses to supervision violations. And much of the challenges that you'll be seeing in the slides to follow, I think, led to the policy options in House Bill 230. And zooming out to cast the big picture, what the aim is to enhance your existing sanction and incentives matrix, which in Wyoming is called the PRISM, which guides your probation and your parole officers to respond to probationer and parolee behavior. The negative behaviors receive sanctions, the positive behaviors receive incentives, and it's a way of keeping people accountable to their supervision conditions in the community while avoiding a full revocation. And so what our intentions with providing policy options that resulted in Draft Bill 230 was an effort to provide more options for sanctioning and access to programming short of a full-blown revocation. And so there are a variety of behaviors that are happening when someone's on supervision, when the negative ones receive the sanctions in response. And the more that you can expand and utilize the community-based sanctions, the more you can avoid the high cost that comes from a full-blown revocation. And as Jen would emphasize, it's not just the sanction that you're looking at, it's actually the behavior change that results from the access to the programming and the access to the effective supervision. This is the main driver of prison population growth. This reflects the admissions to prison from fiscal 2013 to 17. And you can see that the new court commitments in terms of new sentences directly from the courts dropped a little bit by 5%, but the increases came on the probation and parole revocations. Slide number 34, the bottom of that page, shows the indicated reasons for the revocations. And here we try to note that, for example, your probation revocations, 84% of them involved a violation with no new felony conviction. The remaining 16% involved a new felony conviction. To the right, that text is meant to emphasize that it wasn't your first violation that caused you to be revoked. And the stakeholders you've heard from already today indicate it's a series of behaviors, a range of behaviors that compel probation and parole officers to recommend revocation and for sentencing courts or judges to revoke and incarcerate. When we broke down with the audit information the DOC has, the reasons for the condition violations fell across 3 categories. The first 3 were all substance use related. The second involved a variety of non-substance use violations. It could include a misdemeanor arrest, repeatedly missing appointments, the whole array of behavior that is out of bounds for supervision. And the third was unknown. So the rationale for enhancing your administrative sanctions means that every sanction, every behavior that's negative receives a proportional response. And for changing offender behavior, the most effective responses are delivered swiftly. There's very little delay in time between the behavior and the sanction. They're delivered with certainty. That means that the probation officer is providing responses consistently. The probationer is able to expect and predict what's going to come. And And finally, the cost effectiveness, that you're using your resources utility at the greatest point that you can. You're not using the big hammer on cases that can be handled with a short jail stay or with a referral to an ACC. This is the cost of a probation parole revocation, $30 million. And the reason for enhancing your incentives and sanctions matrix is that those sanctions can be imposed with much less cost than it would be for full-blown revocation. The average length of stay for a probation revocation is 19 months. For a parole revocation, it's 11 months. So it's a combination of factors that contribute to on slide 36, the fact that 30% of people in prison on any given day in Wyoming are there following a parole revocation. Essentially, it's the volume of people who come back, the sheer number of them, and the length of stay. That's what drives prison populations, how many come in and how long they stay. Recognizing the key role that is on slide 37, that substance addiction and mental health relates to outcomes on supervision, the third challenge involves the barriers to timely, specialized substance addiction and mental health treatment. We provided a case involving a woman whose situation is quite common across Wyoming, in that she has received multiple interactions with the criminal justice system beginning at an early age. She had, in terms of experiencing sexual abuse as a minor, witnessed domestic abuse as a child, diagnosed with ADHD, schizophrenia, anxiety, and depression, and a history of substance use, including alcohol and methamphetamine. The reason we got this information is through a redacted pre-sentence investigation. We wanted to share it because it shows a timeline of her involvement with the criminal justice system, showing that it began at age 19 and that her participation in the criminal justice system really spiked around age 24 to 26. There was a period of calm when there were no more drug, alcohol, public order charges that she received between age 26 and age 32, when she was receiving treatment in the community. She was engaged, her life was on track, things were going well. A relapse occurred at around age 31, and then you can see age 33, a spike in the charges and involvement in the justice system, which led to probation term in 2014, which she was on until 2016 before being ultimately revoked recently. And so what we're trying to show here is that there are two systems that are managing one person. And your chance here as part of Justice Reinvestment is linking together those two different systems to maximize the assets that each system has to change someone's behavior and help them avoid penetration in the criminal justice system. Slide 40 and 41, the one that follows, will wrap up the substance use and mental health section. We wanted to show here, regarding those two different tracks of probation, parole, and behavioral health, that looking at the number of people on felony probation in 2017, 80% received a referral to a program. Most of these programs, people pay out of pocket. These programs are related to conditions that are set at sentencing. They are tied into the factors that make someone at a risk to reoffend. And substance addiction accounts for 3/4 of the program referrals that people received in 2017. So there's a lot of referral action happening from the probation and the parole into, as we learned in the earlier section, many of your community mental health and substance abuse centers. So you can see in a largely rural and frontier state with challenges getting people into treatment, you have 18 of these community mental health and substance abuse centers with coverage in every county, where people can access services in the open access care model. Even with that open access service, there are a number of barriers involving, which we would like to list out: insufficient levels of treatment. Someone might need a bed, but they're only able to get intensive outpatient. Lack of peer supports, some transportation challenges, inconsistent integration between supervision and treatment, and a challenge involving a continuum of care of people who leave a prison and are in a place where they might have detoxed, that are not coming back into the community and are at high risk for overdose, high risk for relapse, and really need that continuity to connect them through those two parts of the system. So I think that a major asset involving the work that you did at the last meeting is authorizing the drafting of bills for consideration per slide 43 that we think address the challenges that we've covered so far. And they address some issues involving victim compensation. So the first is the focusing your probation and parole resources on people who are at greatest risk of failing on supervision. And that is the origin of the bill drafts 217, 227, 231. And the second challenge involved Bill Draft 230, holding people on supervision accountable with swift, certain, proportional sanctions. And the third is helping victims receive coverage for mental health expenses, Bill Draft 221. Not included here is behavioral health, mental health and substance use. In some ways, that bill was not authorized, and also in some ways that's work in development. And that's something that I was going to skip ahead real quick just to cover something that we think is a bigger picture item that's not reflected in bill drafts, but it relates to the impact that you can have on your criminal justice system. This is slide 53. We looked again at the slide you saw earlier in the presentation about the projected growth in your prison population. And looking at a measure of impact of recidivism reduction on page 53, estimating that if you can reduce parole and probation revocation volume and or length of stay by up to 25%, you can reduce the prison population by as many as 285 beds by 2024. So that curve you have projected in your prison population can be bent downward by addressing this driver of your prison population growth. What volume come back to prison and how long do they stay in prison? This is one way of showing that not only are there positives for bending that curve in your prison population, but you also can avoid contracting prison beds. We chose the most conservative estimate for how we might define cost avoidance. You could look at it in terms of prison construction, operating costs, a variety of other factors. We included only the cost per day of contracting out of state. We use that because your prisons are full, and right now, until expansion of capacity occurs, that's your one way of managing that. There are certainly many goals that can flow from this, including setting a goal of reducing the need for beds by 80. And in those cases, the folks who are housed right now in private prisons in Mississippi could come home. Your contracting of jail beds, those could be terminated. But just for the sake of this meeting and showing how recidivism can relate to cost, we wanted to provide this estimate here. We think that's a pretty ambitious way to talk about it. Flat 25% reduction without recognizing a need for maybe stepping up to reach that level. And it's not uncommon for states to set goals for recidivism reduction. Your state Department of Corrections has done it. States around the country are participating in an initiative called statewide recidivism reduction. So we estimated, looking at the next 5 years, beginning in, this is slide 55, fiscal year 2020 through 2024, what if Wyoming begins with a 5% reduction in recidivism, and then each successive year increases it by 5 percentage points, arriving at 25%? That would enable you to avert 252 beds that otherwise would require contracting, and would avoid $18.1 million in averted costs from contracts over that 5-year period. The role that data has played in this process so far creates a way of framing a look at your system and seeing what trends are occurring and how it's impacting a variety of factors. This would not be a DOC recidivism reduction because, as you've heard, it relies that outcome is achieved through all the work of people in your criminal justice system as part of that. And our measure of recidivism we offered is defined as such because it taps into the factor that's driving your prison population growth, volume coming back on probation, parole revocations, and length of stay. Along the way, it would probably make sense also to track issues involving arrest and new conviction. Those can accompany and complement those because you'd want to have that broader context. This next slide here in 56, we depict over that 5-year period what a kind of a goal, a stepped up goal of increasingly 5 percentage points each year would provide. I'd mentioned the 18.1 million all the way to the right for the total over that 5-year period. But you could see some impact beginning in 2020, again, under this very conservative estimate. And what we are putting forward is a way for you to consider 2 different reinvestment options as Wyoming, say, policymakers move forward with these policy options in front of you today, with other administrative rules or other levers you could pull. is the option of reinvesting 3/4 of the avoided costs or reinvesting half of the avoided costs. Either way, you would avoid you would avoid more money than you otherwise would have to spend to contract over that period. So, for example, if over 5 years you hit that 25% reduction in recidivism, 18.1 million in avoided costs, you could reinvest over that full 5-year period 13.6 million and still have 4.5 million afterwards. That could calibrate one way or the other. What we put down at the bottom of the table includes the priority reinvestment areas based on discussions that we've had with you all, with stakeholders and other policymakers along the way. The first being the increasing the admissions of people on probation and parole to timely specialized mental health and substance addiction treatment, fulfilling perhaps those barriers to access that we've talked about, utilizing your community mental health and substance use centers. And second, improving recidivism outcomes for your ISP and your ACC population, which are your options for increased surveillance and supervision, but they don't currently have the assurance of programming to address the reasons why that person is violating or is higher risk to begin with. We published a report at CSG on page 57 called Reducing Recidivism, States Deliver Results. This was from last year, and we just wanted to share one of the states that came up. This is Michigan, the next one is North Carolina, just showing sort of how in assisting them, we calculated recidivism reduction. This was for Michigan calculated in terms of admissions to prison due to a parole violation. They were able to report a 24% reduction over 5 years. Going back 5 years earlier, you see even bigger reductions because their starting point was quite high. They tracked the violent crime trends over that same time year period and the rearrest among people on parole. So for public safety measures that could accompany your recidivism reduction goal, that could give you that broader context of what else is happening. So that while you're looking to manage reductions in revocations, you're looking at the perhaps arrest or conviction information of people to look at the broader behaviors that could be captured in that. And North Carolina dropped their probation violations, admissions to prison by 48%. So it's all about how you track it, how you want to cut it. And that can be the work that can be relating to the bigger picture of how the bill drafts you're looking at today and your broader approaches toward reform would be developed over time. But we wanted to demonstrate that there is some element of both cost and population while enabling you also to meet the priority goals that we've been hearing a great deal about the last day, involving access to timely specialized treatment and inclusion of programming. So I went a bit out of order with the presentation to try to accommodate the timeline. We figured out there might also be a role for us to help with any of the bill draft discussions. We will, of course, remain in the room to be pulled up for any discussions as it rolls on. But we'd be more than happy to answer any questions regarding the analysis shared already or any of the bill draft questions that the committee might have. Mr. Chairman, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Pelka, and we're sorry we had to pressure you to condense. I think you did a very nice job of getting through it in a meaningful way. Any questions by the committee on the presentation we've just heard? Okay, not right now, but the afternoon isn't over, so.
We'll be ready, Mr. Chairman.
Yes, now I promised 2 individuals another bite at the apple. Mr. Fuchs, is there anything you want to contribute here, or maybe just stand for questions in relation to what we've just heard?
Mr. Chairman, excuse me, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, my name is Franz Fuchs, Policy Analyst, Department of Health. Again, we worked on that sort of interaction of the DOC and Department of Health, mental health substance abuse data, and most of the analysis is in that technical appendix at the end of your presentation. So if there are any questions on that, I'm happy to answer those. But we can also take any via email or phone calls later on if those do arise.
Okay, thank you. Committee? All right, not right now. Thank you. Thank you for being here today. And Director Lampert?
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. Bob Lampert, Director of the Department of Corrections. Thank you for giving me this opportunity to provide some summarizing comments before you begin to work the bills. I know that you have a lot of work to do, and so I'm going to be brief. First, I wanted to state that there's no doubt that the decisions that you make today will determine how much money the state will spend on corrections, specifically for the construction and operation of prison beds well into the future. You've already heard repeatedly from CSG and me the numbers and the projections for growth if the decision is to continue the status quo as to who is coming to prison and for how long. Over time, within the current framework, we've seen sentence lengths increasing along with the incarceration rate in the state. And without some change in public policy, which is again set by you, and we recognize that, I would predict more of the same in the future. While incarceration rates and the number of prison beds in our state have increased, it's important to remember that crime rates have decreased. Some would argue that that's evidence that the current policies that we have in place are working exactly right. That may be true and it may not. But what is factual is that it's more expensive to put someone in prison, and it's more disruptive and provides a lot more collateral consequences than not putting them in prison. Those costs are even higher when you also expect the quality of the correctional institutions, treatment and services to be humane and habilitative, not only because those things are constitutionally required, but also because of the right thing to do. I'm proud of the Wyoming Department of Corrections, and I think rightfully so. Your corrections professionals are doing a very difficult job of working with broken people who are the flotsam and jetsam of society. They're people who are deemed unworthy of living freely in our communities because of their criminal behavior. But our charge is to help them become law-abiding and contributing community members. We do that better than almost any other correctional system in the United States. And I can assure you that we will continue to do that regardless of the policy directions you take today. If there's no direction change, however, the state will have to invest more into prison space and the people who make corrections happen than if you move these bills forward. Mr. Chairman, you and your fellow legislators have heard from me and heard me say repeatedly over the past 15 years that my vision for the state of Wyoming is that, and for the Wyoming criminal justice system, is to help make sure that that corrections isn't the leading growth industry in the state. And that we'd rather operate a Department of Corrections than a Department of Collections. Despite my best efforts, though, policy decisions made during my tenure have continued to drive the need for more and more prison beds. That's frustrating to you, and it's also frustrating to those of us who sincerely believe in the power of people to change, even criminal behavior, if they're given the expectation, the opportunity, the training, the treatment, the support, and the resources necessary to do so, especially early on in the cycle. At the minimum, we are looking for ways to shift our existing resources to the front end of supervision by limiting to some extent the total length of time that we have successful probationers and parolees under supervision. In limiting length, we can intensify front-end services and supervision and also focus on higher risk individuals. The evidence says, that it's smarter to tackle criminal behavior than, there are smarter ways to tackle criminal behavior than locking people up and just waiting for time and maturity to change them. You've been bombarded with that evidence from CSG over the interim. You've heard about efforts in other states that have worked. I see the bills that you'll be considering in a few minutes as simple, common sense guardrails that will help ensure the right people are targeted to the most effective and least restrictive intervention needed to address their criminality, hold them accountable, and keep our communities safe. Unfortunately, I'm not sure we can make effective and lasting change around the tendency to incarcerate without putting some guardrails around discretion. I don't think they're sentencing guidelines, but they are guardrails. Again, with the triple goal of holding offenders accountable, making communities safer, and reducing the total future costs of corrections. Therefore, we strongly support the concepts underlying the bills that you'll be considering. You'll determine if you think that they're perfect as written or whether they need to be tweaked. We stand subject to any questions during that process. We do agree that there could be room for compromise and further discussion, but we would urge that the legislation move forward through the process. Although I genuinely hope to be retained by Governor-elect Gordon as your corrections director, it is very possible that today may be also my last JJC meeting. Just in case, I want to thank all the members of the committee for your hard work and diligence on this difficult issue of criminal justice reform. I believe that if you follow the evidence that's been given to you about what works and stand firm on the concepts that Senator Hicks and Senator Nethercott so aptly outlined in their comments, that you'll see results that work for the citizens, the state, and the bottom line, as well as all of our stakeholders. Lest it not be said, working with the legislature for the past 15 years has been like the aftermath of a good gym workout. A little painful at times during and after the exercise, but definitely worth the effort. As you work these bills, if you have any questions for corrections, we stand ready to answer. Thank you.
Thank you, Director. Would anyone like to interact with Director Lampert on those comments? Senator Anselmi Dalton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thank you, Director Lampert. What I'm thrilled to hear is that you embrace this. You're welcome to try change and try to move things forward. I think that's really great to hear. And I respect all of your work. I just was going to ask one quick question. Static 99R, I know the judges were concerned that sex offender test doesn't work really well under the model we're using now. Is that a really expensive program to do so that we feel like we're getting the high risk offenders on one of the areas that concern the judges more, that we could actually tell if they're high risk? And is that something we could buy?
Mr. Chairman.
Director.
Senator, one thing that hasn't been clear in the testimony to you is we do use the compass as a baseline assessment, but we also have trailer assessments for specialized populations. One of those is sex offender treatment. So we have the static 99, the stable and acute, that we use to assess specific to sex offenders' risk levels. Sometimes sex offenders might come out as a low risk under compass by itself, and in the subsequent trailer assessments, their risk may come out higher. So although the courts are getting the compass assessment and have in the past that outlines low risk, when we look at the total risk, it comes out as medium or high on certain offenders. So we are actually supervising at a higher level, which I think the last JJC meeting you heard that we're overriding 60% of people over and above what the compass recommends. And the bulk of that is because of those specialty trailer assessments that also assess risk. Another example of that is we're just implementing the DUI and are looking for validated domestic violence. Those are the three areas where gut assessments don't necessarily match compass assessments.
Okay, thank you. Anyone else?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
All right, thank you, Director. The time has come to move to working on the bills. We will work through them in order. And a couple of little footnotes here at the start is we will ask the staff before each bill if there's anything they've accumulated, any substantive comments they've written down as the audience has spoken here in the last 2 days that they want to refresh us on before we go into that discussion of the bills. And I would also give the committee permission, if you need my permission, to call on people in the audience and deal with specific issues that might arise during the afternoon. So having said that, let's take up the 221 draft crime victim compensation eligibility clarification. Woo.
Chairman, move the bill.
Moved by Christensen, seconded by Anselmi Dalton. Staff, do you have any input for us as we begin our discussion?
Mr. Chairman, I don't recall any.
Yes, Mr. Chairman. As Tori was saying, I don't recall any significant concerns with this bill or suggestions on the bill. It seems to be okay as written for your consideration, at least.
Okay. Mr. Co-Chairman.
Mr. Chairman, for those of you doing this wonderful work in the future, you might want to adopt the Chamber's model of bills There seems to be no controversy, complete and full support.
Yes. No, no questions, no suggested amendments? Questions been called for. Staff, will you take the roll, please?
Mr. Chairman, this would be a vote for the committee to sponsor 19 LSO 221, working draft .5. Senator Anselmi Dalton.
Aye.
Senator Hicks.
Aye.
Senator Kinski.
Excuse, Kinski and Beitman are both excused, right? Kinski and Beitman are both excused, and I was negligent in not announcing that sooner, so.
Senator Nethercott. Representative Jennings. Representative Olson. Representative Pelkey. Representative Pennell.
Aye.
Representative Salazar.
Aye.
Representative Stith.
Aye.
Representative
I
Winters.
got mine out of the way.
Chairman Christensen.
Aye.
Chairman Kirkbride.
Aye.
Mr. Chairman, the motion passes.
Okay, motion is passed. Draft 221 moves on to January. Our second bill to take up, draft 0231, limitation on length of probation. Is there a motion? Okay, moved by Pelkey, seconded by Anselmi Dalton. Is there any suggestion
Yes, Mr.
for amendments, Mr. Co-Chairman?
Just a couple of amendments on page 3. On line 10, at the end of, or after months, semicolon, provided, comma, however, that the sentencing judge may deviate up to and including the maximum period of probation for good cause shown upon the record after considering public safety, rehabilitation, and determination of other goals of sentencing. And I can give them a copy. And then the second part of that would be that same language at the end of line 19, different in a different statute.
Okay, I got a second from Pennell. And do you want both those considered as one amendment?
Yes.
All right.
Same language, same page.
Okay, so moved by the co-chairman, seconded by Pennell. Do you have any discussion on your amendment?
This kind of goes to the concerns that were brought up both from the public defender side, that we would get unanticipated consequences, maybe going in the exact wrong direction. And then we heard that again from the judiciary today, just asking for some allowance with those, you know, it doesn't get rid of the 42 months, but it puts some possibilities that they can look at based on safety, rehabilitation, or goals of sentencing. So it gives them a little bit of room while keeping the 42 months in place.
Okay, and would you mind reading your amendment one more time?
Provided, however, that the sentencing judge may deviate up to and including the maximum period of probation for good cause shown upon the record after considering public safety, rehabilitation, and determination of any other goals of sentencing. I can give it to the staff.
Okay, then that refreshed us. Representative Stitt?
Just a question to clarify. After the word maximum, it says maximum and it says period of probation. Does that create a self-referential problem because what we're talking about is the period of probation? Would it be smoother if we said up to the, instead of the word probation, say maximum period of sentence?
Okay.
No?
Accomplish the same thing. That'd be friendly.
Friendly? Friendly in the second?
Second.
Okay, thank you, Representative Stiff. Any further comments on the proposed amendment? Representative Jennings?
Just a question, Mr. Chairman, to the bringer of the amendment. I thought the judge's testimony used clear and convincing evidence in there somehow for some reason. Was there a reason that you chose this over what the suggestion was?
Mr. Chairman, just based on their testimony and then clarifying conversation with them.
Okay. Any other discussion of the amendments? Okay, let's proceed to a vote on the amendment.
Mr. Chairman,
Senator Hicks.
question, and I think it was brought up earlier. I'm just wondering if when we enumerate the reasons why they can go beyond that, maybe we would want to modify that just slightly to say not limited to. In other words, there may be other circumstances. If we put that in there, the way I understand the amendment, that would be the only things they could consider to go beyond that 42 months. And I would hate to have again, trying to leave the maximum discretion with the judiciary that not limited to those provisions. So I would make that as a form to modify that as a friendly amendment to the amendment.
Mr. Chairman,
Mr. Co-Chairman.
before I accept the friendly, I'm just wondering if we could get Ellison's input. If we need that, or when they look at it, included in the language. Not that I'm opposed to it, just make sure that it still keeps us generally within the spirit.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Christensen, understanding that we're kind of looking at it for the first 2 minutes here. I see Senator Hicks' concern. The last phrase, however, says deterrence and other goals of sentencing. So that other goals of sentencing phrase may capture that.
Okay, Senator Hicks, you're happy with that?
Withdraw that, and I think we'll have another opportunity probably to do some wordsmithing or clarification as it moves forward.
And maybe when we all have it in front of us, it'll be easier to make those kind of changes. Anyone else want to comment on the amendment? Okay, call for the question on the amendment. Question's been called for. All in favor of the amendment as stated, say aye. Aye. Opposed, say no. Okay, that amendment carries. Any further suggestions for amendments?
Mr. Chairman.
Representative Olson.
Well, I don't want to muck this up too much, but so I'm not seconded already. So I have extreme reservations with what we're doing with 713-302. I don't feel what I liked was the testimony that we heard from Mr. Pelka that we may have the data that we need to be able to hone in and look at the types of offenses that we really want to focus on. 302, as written here, encompasses all felonies. I am not comfortable putting probation or any type of incarceration limitations on all felonies. So we're talking about violent offenders. We're talking about sex offenders. Everything else around this bill, 301, and the latter part of the bill dealing with drug offenses is exactly what I believe was the scope of what we wanted to do when we talk about criminal justice reform. So I think there's only two amendments I can possibly think of, Mr. Chairman. One is I would feel more comfortable removing Section 302 unless we have honed in on those. Excuse me, Senator Nethercott. Unless we hone in on the offenses that we know we actually want to address. Otherwise, this committee is going to make a blanket policy statement that it is acceptable to lower probation on sex offenders and other violent crimes. And we're going to hope that our judiciary obviously doesn't do that with the language that, Mr. Chairman, you have crafted. But we're issuing a blanket policy statement that I'm not comfortable with.
Okay. So is an amendment, or are you just discussing, and that's fine if you are?
Yeah, I'm really just discussing, Mr. Chairman, because I can look at the list that we have under 301 and I can contemplate putting in an exception list to it. But again, I would like to have the data from Mr. Pelka so that we can hone in on those offenses. It's either that or I'm more comfortable striking 302 altogether.
Okay.
And I don't know if we have a response on when we may have that data.
Shall we go to Representative Pelkey?
Thank you. I mean, we addressed that delineation between nonviolent and violent felonies in a number of places in statute. You could operate off the list that prevents you from getting an expungement, for example. The list of violent felonies that would fit into that. You could probably exclude those from that provision if you find it necessary to do so.
Senator Hicks?
Mr. Chairman, I too share Representative Olson's concerns, but I'm willing to pass the bill out the way it is right now with the idea that we try to get that data. And here's why. It's much easier for us to amend a provision out once we get data than it is to bring in a whole other amendment. So I look at this because I share those concerns. This is a placeholder for me right now, that section 302. I do think that we heard that data could be provided in the next month. So I'm inclined to leave that section with the amendment that just passed on there, with the idea that section's a placeholder. I think we expand this discussion with better data and better information, but I do share Representative Olson's concern on this, that right now this is just a little too broad given the nature of it. But I would rather have that data to pare it down than try to bring all that information back into the bill when we get to the session. So for discussion, Mr. Chairman.
Representative Olson. But I'm going to go back to Representative Olson. Did you get, or would you like a response from Mr. Pelka on the availability of the data?
Mr. Chairman, I wouldn't. Here's why. Because as Senator Hicks has alluded to several times over the last 2 days, we don't know who's going to be on this committee. And I think which means a brand new committee is going to have to pick up the conversation where we left off, hoping to continue our efforts and our goals with those policy concerns in mind, or we're looking to amend things on the floor. So before any of these bills see prime time on the floor, if the data is available to us from Mr. Pelka and the Judiciary Committee contains enough of us, then it may remain the same. But those are my reservations. Even if the data's a month out, how do you know what this committee looks like and what they're going to do with it? But an answer from Mr. Pelka would be appreciated.
Okay, Mr. Pelka, if you've got a response, that'd be great.
Afternoon, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. The data that representative requests would I don't imagine be very hard at all to do. And what we would do is design a new slide depicting time to recidivism by type of offense, and provide information about variations across offense of conviction. You know, we couldn't have it done by 4 o'clock today, but it could be done in a straightforward way and vetted with agencies to make sure we're analyzing it right and resubmit. And having seen other states that develop exemption language, you know, be interested to see if offense of conviction would fit into any of the categories that Senator Christensen offered in his amendment. That might be another place for the time being where opportunities for exemptions to be provided for type of offense could be housed in one of the already criteria, one of the other criteria already given to the judges.
Okay. You're good, Representative Olson? And I first had co-chairman, did you have something? Senator Hicks.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, and I do think Representative Olson brings up a good point of the potential for a new committee, but there is another alternative out there. We could have LSO draft up some language. I've done this on other committees, that this committee would then basically vote electronically, either a thumbs up or a thumbs down on that amendment. Another alternative that we have before the session we could do, if that's the direction the chair would like to go with that. I do think Representative Olson's point is this committee is likely to look a whole lot better and ask them to come in and make a thumbs up or thumbs down decision Without the background information, it's probably wrong with folly.
Mr. Chairman,
Mr. Co-Chairman.
if you need my, if the good senator needs my glasses to recognize how good looking we are now.
That's right.
I hear the suggestion that's been offered, Mr. Chairman, but the concern I think would be on a telephone vote is we're going to do a roll call vote, and the rules of the roll call talk about who's in attendance at the meeting. So to try and unwind all this, I do have great confidence that there'll be several of the brightest minds in the legislature will continue to be on this joint committee, and we'll have that plenty of time if this bill passes to deal with that in whichever house it starts at. But this particular issue isn't going to go away. Judges are certainly aware of it, the prosecutors, the defense attorneys, trial attorneys.
Okay.
Mr. Chairman.
Senator Nethercott.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So in addressing some of the concerns that have been brought about this subparagraph B, I'll just share with you my concerns when I heard Senator Christensen's amendment, which was that it completely nullifies the entire purpose of the criminal justice reinvestment of limiting the term of probation, which is what we've been trying to focus on. So by providing that amendment that we all unanimously passed, really broadened the scope and allows the judges to come up with the necessary factors and findings to support going beyond the 42 months. And in my experience, there's never a challenge in doing that for the judges when they need to make those types of findings. And I would say that any probably violent felony or sex offense would provide that level of justification that we found in our amendment to go beyond the 42 months. So I'm concerned that actually the amendment probably takes the teeth out of the 42-month concept. But I'm also of the belief to give our judges that level of discretion. But I just want to remind, it's hard when we pass such a long amendment and don't have it written in front of us. But I want to remind the committee what it says. So unless otherwise authorized by law, no term of probation imposed shall exceed the maximum term of imprisonment allowed by law. A reminder to the body that this bill just addresses probation. So in those cases where an offender has committed a violent offense, the judge can still sentence them to prison, which may be appropriate. So these are only those circumstances where the judge has determined that probation is appropriate given the facts and circumstances of that case. And so then the legislature is providing statutory guidance as to the term of probation associated with those crimes. So the language goes on to read, any term of probation imposed under this section for a felony offense shall in no case exceed 42 months, provided, however, that the sentencing judge may deviate up to and including the maximum term of imprisonment for good cause shown on the record after considering public safety, rehabilitation, deterrence, and the effort and goals of sentencing. I believe there is full discretion and authority for a judge under the right circumstances to go above the 42 months in light of the language we've just amended into that section. So with that, those concerns of Representative Olson, I don't think are met because of Senator Christensen's amendment, and I support passage of the bill with including subparagraph B as amended.
All right. We're thinking for a moment. Any other amendments?
Chairman.
Representative Olson.
Yeah, I'm just going to make my amendment. I move to delete lines 2 through 10 on page 3.
Okay, moved by Olson, seconded by Winters to remove lines 2 through 10 on page 3 of Bill 231. Any discussion on the amendment?
Mr. Chairman.
I think LSO may have a question.
Okay, Representative Stith?
On and against the amendment, the data seems to show that reducing the term of probation makes a lot of sense because it free up resources that are otherwise being spent on probation in excess of 36 months. So if we delete this, we're really, not accomplishing what we had hoped to accomplish. So on and against the amendment.
Okay. Representative Olson?
Just in response to the comments, Representative Stith, it does actually still accomplish that, because for first offenders, the 42-month provision still applies. For all of our drug offenses that we're worried about, we're still going to apply that on a first offense as well. The concern is that we don't have the data in front of us to determine which offenses we want to apply that 42-month provision to. And if I agree with Senator Nethercott's analysis of Chairman Christensen's amendment. There's no point in having the 302 amendment in this legislation with the amendment, because we've actually given complete discretion back to the judiciary. I don't think we've actually honed in on anything on probation. So we've accomplished nothing. But instead, what we've done is made a policy statement that it is acceptable to restrict probationary periods on violent offenders and sex offenders. And I don't think that that's a wise decision for this body to do. We have the potential to have the data. Mr. Pelka has promised that he can get us the data, that he can line by line it for us. So why are we rushing through this? All we have to do is patiently wait for the data. If you vote to remove this, it's the exact same logic that Senator Hicks proposed. If you remove 302 amendment and Mr. Pelka gives us the data, you can plug 302 back in with the limiting offenses that we deem fit. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Anselmi Dalton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. On and against the amendment, I'd like to remind, I think the judge indicated that Section A of 1713-302 said, except for felony murder or capital crimes, those still could be placed on probation up to the maximum amount. So we're not really dealing with that. Maybe I shouldn't have voted on the other amendment, but I do think that we are trying to do sentencing reform, and I think this is a placeholder. I think we can have further discussions and see what Mr. Pelka gives us. And sort of opposite what you said, I think I'm more with Hicks. Let's leave this as a placeholder so we can work on it when we get to the new body and be able to discuss it more when we see what we have. Maybe we'll amend it based on obviously your concerns, which are justified, and put in maybe instead, hey, this is a level, how they said maybe they do it by levels, but that would be, I would say, let's keep it as a placeholder so we could discuss it as a body when we come back.
Mr. Co-Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think the benefit of leaving it in there is it allows the state, people across the state, to look at something and be able to have a discussion on it. The removal is there's an absence there, and should we bring it back, or should you bring it back in the session, it'll be without the luxury of having people to really digest it and talk about it and respond. And so the fact that it's in there, easy to remove, but it allows that conversation and stimulates kind of thoughts across the state.
Okay, any further discussion on the amendment to remove lines 2 through 10?
Call for the question.
Question's been called for. All in favor of the amendment, say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, the amendment, say no.
No.
No. Noes have it. Any further suggestions for amendments? Any further suggestion for amendments? Any?
Question on the bill.
Okay. No further discussion on the bill? Question's been called for. Staff, would you please call the roll?
Mr. Chairman, this would be a vote for the committee to sponsor 19 LSO 231 as amended. Senator Anselmi Dalton. Senator Hicks.
Aye.
Senator Nethercott.
Aye.
Representative Jennings.
Aye.
Representative Olson.
Aye.
Representative Pelkey.
Aye.
Representative Pinnell.
Aye.
Representative Salazar.
Aye.
Representative Stith.
Aye.
Representative Winters.
Aye.
Chairman Christensen.
Aye.
Chairman Kirkbride.
Aye.
Mr. Chairman, the motion passes.
Okay, thank you. Bill passes 4-0 and 8-0 in both houses. On to our third bill for consideration, the limitation on length of parole bill, number 227. So does anyone like to move the bill?
Move.
Moved by Pelkey, seconded by Anselmi Dalton. Any suggestions for amendments?
Chairman, just maybe some discussion. Mr. Chairman, on discussion on the bill as opposed to amendment, see if it stimulates everything. It seems like the Department of Corrections was concerned about this being a kind of a de-incentive to the parole board. That was the word I wrote down, and I don't know if we have the parole board with us today. But just not to invite a big long conversation, but just to make sure on this bill in particular, since that's who we're talking about, is the parole board essentially. Wondered if we could invite the director up.
Okay.
Regarding just that narrow topic.
That's fine.
Gonna affect their.
Between the maximum and minimum, the concerns were obviously brought up about the judiciary and what effect that might have on them. All of that seems to be very speculative. In terms of what the board itself might be concerned with, certainly one of the issues that they always look at is the issue of good time. And presently, we don't have any sort of an idea of how these short variations might affect that. If you look at parole good time specifically allows for 20 days per month of good time. So essentially, you reduce the amount of time that you have on parole. You only serve 1/3 of it. You could think of it that way. So if you have a 3-year period of time, it'd be 1 year on parole. If you did well during that 1 year of parole, you're now done. So that would have to make be changed, if you will. And that's changed in the governor's rules.
Okay. Any interaction with that thought, Mr. Co-Chairman? Okay.
Mr. Chairman, there's some language for a similar amendment that allows some judicial or sentencing judge discretion, but we can talk about that in a second.
Okay. Can I go back to the staff, because I was going to invite them to remind us of any of the discussion that came up in the testimony. Was there anything that we should be dealing with here that you noted in your notes? And then, yeah, so I'd like to go to staff first, and then I've got a couple people lined up.
Mr. Chairman, in my notes, I just had that Director Causey wanted to speak to it again.
Okay.
And I think that his memo indicated that there may, well, no, that was a different issue. And perhaps Mr. Lindley or Mr. Lampert indicated that that was a complicated bill to alter parole and suggested the good time reduction. That's the extent of my notes on suggestions.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Pelka had a hand up. And you, Mr. Causey, you can stay there if you want until we've finished working this bill.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. Marc Pelka, Council State Governments. We prepared bill draft summaries for the different bills, and I neglected to share content on Bill Draft 227, limitations on the length of parole. And it's on page 3 of the draft. And when we at CSG reviewed the bill draft, we traced its origins back to discussion about focusing supervision on the early period of supervision terms. The previous bill the committee discussed applied it to probation, and we suspect that 227 was drafted to apply the policy to parole, the parole supervision period. The purpose was, and I believe that what could have brought this about was the committee authorized LSO to draft a bill that would apply a similar cap, but to parole while being within the bounds of the statutes. And I think that LSO not to assume, I don't think they had any other option for drafting but to use this approach to modify relation of min to max. While we reviewed the bill, it does fulfill that objective of trying to front load supervision resources, but it does it in a way that's aggressive in modifying how min and maxes relate. And so we, in our summary, described there being some adverse effects on sentencing policy. And indeed, when we discussed with stakeholders by phone this bill draft before the meeting, we indicated that we saw some unintended consequences from this. Namely, Jen has perspective specifically on it. And
yeah, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, I think one of the main concerns with this bill draft is that it would shorten the parole window available for inmates. And as a result, it has the potential to increase individuals maxing out of the institution or incentivizing individuals to refuse parole in order to max out of the institution without any parole supervision. In accordance with best practices, you would want to see a term of supervision for inmates leaving the institution. So we think this bill has the potential to lessen the amount of individuals leaving the institution on some type of supervision due to that short parole window created by this bill.
Okay, thank you. Senator Anselmi Dalton.
No, Chairman, I had just looked at that memo before they came up and I had seen that they had recommended against the bill.
Okay, thank you. Anyone else? Mr. Co-Chairman.
Mr. Chairman, I think along the lines that were just raised about unintended consequences, and it probably applies more to particular crimes, but I've got an amendment for page 3 on line 4, a new paragraph C, and I think this accomplishes some of that, but it'll be good for discussion. It says, notwithstanding the above, the sentencing judge may impose a maximum term exceeding the minimum terms above for good cause shown upon the record after considering public safety, rehabilitation, deterrence, and other goals of sentencing. And that's the motion. And I think this also goes to one of the, should I talk about it a little more? Would you like a second first?
Is there a second? Seconded by Pelkey.
He's fascinated.
You always fascinate me.
Okay.
Mr. Chairman, I think this goes to one of the concerns raised by the trial lawyers is if it gets too narrow, the under the guise, whether it's public safety or rehabilitation, that the sentencing may actually be extended in some instances. And so to have that allowance allows it to be a little more finely tooled as opposed to let's just add a longer sentence since we have less options.
Okay. Representative Stiff.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Do you mind just reading the proposed amendment again?
Notwithstanding the above, comma, the sentencing judge may impose a maximum term exceeding the minimum terms above for good cause shown upon the record after considering public safety, rehabilitation, deterrence, and the other goals of sentencing.
Representative Stiff.
Mr. Chairman, I think to accomplish the purpose you want, I think you want to replace the word minimum with something else, like the otherwise maximum, because that's what you mean, I think, right? In other words, as the proposed amendment as drafted just seems to say that for good cause shown, the sentencing term can exceed the minimum. Well, of course, it's always going to exceed the minimum, right?
I think it's referring to the that minimum number up above.
Right, that's the problem, Mr. Chairman.
Representative Stitt.
If the, I think we want to replace the word minimum with the word maximum to achieve the intended purpose.
Okay. We'll have a little consult here. We moved the bill.
See, I mean, we're setting a maximum right now.
No, yes, we moved the bill. And Pelka.
Okay, all I would do. Friendly amendment?
Friendly changed the amendment.
Notwithstanding the above, the sentencing judge may impose a term exceeding the maximum terms above for good cause, et cetera, et cetera. That works, right? That's friendly.
Okay, Mr. Co-Chairman, that's worked for you.
Mr. Chairman,
Oh, yeah.
Is it friendly? And since Representative Pelkey was the second, I guess it works for him. All right.
Mr. Chairman,
Senator, who is it?
may we
Oh, there we go.
Bringing it to you.
perhaps suggest, and we're working off of Brian's notes of what you said, but notwithstanding the above, the judge may impose a maximum term exceeding the term required by paragraph 4 for good cause. That way, referring specifically to the maximum term not to exceed the minimum term clause. And we'd have to probably work on the language.
You'd have to include that too.
This is going to be double friendly.
Senator Hicks.
Don't do that.
A little discussion on it. So I'm trying to figure out where this would actually occur in the process. So does this have to bring, so you have the sentencing, then you go to prison, you get your parole. I'm just trying to figure out within the whole process where this now comes in that a judge starts to put this in. Is it the original sentencing that this would actually happen? And if it does, then I'm kind of back with my colleague, Senator to my left here, is does it now start to defeat the purpose of what we're trying to do is to reduce the number of recidivism through early intervention? Are we now just putting more time on and saying we've punted without putting sideboards on here? That it's all back to just whatever again, I like the flexibility, but I think we're starting to get to the point where we're watering down what we're trying to.
Mr. Co-Chairman.
This is, I think, an answer in response to what the good folks from CSG just said about the original format having unintended consequences. Vote it up or vote it down, but then it certainly changes the nature of the bill, and it's, I think this makes it a less risky bill with some suggested guidelines or at least a fence on it.
Question?
Okay.
On the amendment.
This will be a question on the amendment, which is on line 4 of page 3. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed say no. Amendment carries. 3-0. You kicked the field goal. Any further suggestions for amendments on the bill?
Question on the bill.
Questions been called for on the bill? Staff, would you please call the roll?
Mr. Chairman, this will be a vote for the committee sponsor 19 LSO 227 draft point 6 or point 5 is amended. Senator Selmy Dalton?
No.
Senator Hicks?
No.
Senator Nethercott? Representative Jennings?
We're done.
Oh, your public needs to know how you feel.
Representative Jennings?
No.
Representative Olson?
No.
Representative Pelkey?
Nah.
Representative Pennell?
No.
Representative Salazar? Nope. Representative Stith?
No.
Representative Winters? No. Chairman Christensen?
No.
Chairman Kirkbride?
No.
Motion fails, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, thank you.
Put lipstick on a pig, but it's still a pig.
The bill fails 0408 in both bodies. On to bill number 4, which is number 217, the modification of probation bill. And this time I won't forget to call on staff to see if there's anything you want to remind us of as we head into our discussion, even before we move the bill. Just refresh us on some of the testimony.
Mr. Chairman, I think there was a second one which I'll have to search for, but I recall Judge Day calling attention to page 2, line 23. That whole sentence is, in determining the period of probation or modification of an existing probation, the court may consider, and then we list the 8 factors that they may consider. His concern that he expressed was that that may be viewed as limiting the court's discretion to only those 8 factors. And I think that that is at least a valid concern. One option would be to add language, perhaps a paragraph 9, which would be a Romanet 9, that says something to the effect of any other factor the court finds relevant to the determination. I think there's a number of ways to approach that, but that's one approach.
No, okay, he's got a second.
And the other testimony that I do recall from Tara Muir was an inclusion of the impact on the victim as one of the factors in that list.
Okay, is that, Tori, that's it from your end?
Yes, that I believe is it.
Okay. Would anyone like to move the bill? Moved by Hicks, seconded by Winters. Senator Hicks.
Can I ask staff a question? So on the suggestion that the judges accomplish the same thing by going on page 2, going to slide, court may consider, but not to.
Mr. Chairman,
Yes.
Senator Hicks, yes, I think there's a couple of ways to approach that. That would accomplish the same thing.
All right, thank you.
Okay. Any suggestions for amendments?
I would move that as
Senator?
form as a motion, but on page 2, line 23, after consider, include the language, but not limited to.
Moved by Hicks, seconded by Nethercott. Any discussion on the amendment? Senator Anselmi Dalton?
I was just going to I thought it sounded a little grammatically tenuous. I thought maybe we should just say among other factors. It sounds a little more. I just didn't think the sentence ran on well. So it's a friendly idea.
Okay. Tori?
Mr. Chairman, if I may, grammatically, I agree. I think that we need to add the court may consider, but is not limited to the following factors.
Okay. Senator Hicks, you're good with that?
That's fine.
And-
We're just wordsmithing the intents as long as we capture it.
Right. Senator Nethercott, you're good with that? Question's been called for. All in favor of that amendment, please say aye. Aye. Opposed, say no. Amendment carries. Any further suggestions for amendments? Senator Anselmi Dalton?
Chairman, mine isn't a question for an amendment. It was just I had a question, and maybe someone can answer. I think Director Lampert or maybe said something about there's a rule of criminal procedure that might conflict with this. That was just in my notes, and I just wanted to know if we need to do anything.
Okay. Director, if
Mr. Chairman, Bob Lampert, Director of the Department of Corrections. I don't recall making that statement. It may have been Mr. Lindley. My only comment in this regard of this particular bill was that Romanets 1 through 4 are encompassed within the assessment process and could be duplicative. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
okay. Any further suggestions for amendments to the bill? Representative Pinal?
Mr. Chairman, I had a question. Was there another one regarding to victims? Was there something on this bill that LSO?
There was. Yes, Ms. Muir had made a suggestion, which you want to remind us of that, Tori, what it was?
And Ms. Muir is still in the room, but as I recall, she suggested adding a Romanet to that factor of considerations that included consideration of the needs of the victim. And as I said, Ms. Muir is in the room. Perhaps she has.
So, yes, Ms. Muir, you may come. So presumably paragraph 9 in that list is where it might appear. Ms. Muir, go ahead and explain yourself.
I was speaking fast. Because we take the needs of the victim into consideration when we're collecting data, and what I've seen across many other states is when you're looking at risk assessments, and we've talked about the domestic violence assessment that corrections is trying to find a good one to use, that we really take into account specifically when there's a targeted victim in domestic violence cases, that we take into account, I would suggest, quote, the risk of reoffense against the victim, end quote.
Okay. That would be what she had in mind. Mr. Co-Chairman.
That we're talking about something that's happened in the past, is that future crimes.
Who are you directing that?
Yeah,
Okay.
Are we stretching out, trying to include sentencing conditions on possible future criminal behavior?
Well, what I was going to point out, based on Ms. Muir's comments, is Romanet 7 currently is the risk posed by the defendant to the community. You could argue that the community includes a specific victim, or if the committee wishes, they could add to the end of that sentence, or to a particular victim, or including any victim.
Okay. Representative Pinal?
I think that I'm not going to propose an amendment. I think number 7 does kind of cover that in a roundabout way, but I think that it's covered.
Okay.
That's my opinion.
That's you. So does anyone else want to take that up or suggest another amendment?
Chairman,
Mr. Co-Chairman?
before we do that, in the copy I have, I just want to make sure staff comments on page 4 and 5, still need to address those.
Mr. Chairman,
Congruence, but there's some new lines.
Mr. Chairman,
Yes, Tory.
Senator Christensen, no, that is just an explanation of why that was changed.
Okay. Ms. Muir, thank you as well. Okay, no further amendments. Question has been called for on the bill.
Mr. Chairman, this would be a vote for the committee to sponsor 19 LSO 217 as amended. Senator Anselmi Dalton. Senator Hicks.
Aye.
Senator Nethercott. Representative Jennings.
Aye.
Representative Olson.
Aye.
Representative Pelkey.
Aye.
Representative Pinal.
Aye.
Representative Salazar.
Aye.
Representative Stith.
Aye.
Representative Winters. Chairman Christensen.
Aye.
Chairman Kirkbride.
Aye.
Mr. Chairman, the motion passes.
Okay, the bill passes committee 4-0 and 8-0. Well, good. Now we can all go home. Oh, wait. There's one more bill. Bill 230, probation and parole incentives and sanctions. So before we even ask for a move on the bill, staff, anything in your notes that would help us as we begin this consideration?
Mr. Chairman, I have a list of comments from the various stakeholders highlighting different parts of the bill. The first thing I have was on the language on page 14, line 9, the amendment to 713-304A, that there was some there were some questions about how the inserted language coexists with the current language. Mr. Chairman, the next note I have is on page 6, lines 9 through 11 and 13 to 15. There were questions about basically getting to a consenting Wyoming jail, and that tied in with some comments that were made regarding the language on page 10, lines 15 to 21, which provided that stated that the county sheriff shall house probationers, parolees, and conditional releasees committed to the county jail. There was also some discussion about the per diem rate. Mr. Chairman, there is a staff comment. There's a staff comment on both page 6 and page 10 in regards to this language as well. Mr. Chairman, there were also comments on page 7, I believe, the periods of confinement for up to 90 days. I believe it was either Mr. Lampert or Mr. Lindley who noted, that maybe the committee should consider whether, particularly for paragraph 6, that period should be up to 180 days. Well, that would be conforming. Mr. Chairman, there was another suggestion regarding, I believe for Mr. Riedel, about creating an advisory group to the Department of Corrections on the consideration of validated risk assessments, that this group would contribute to that process in some manner. On page 16, there were questions, the amendment to 713-404, questions regarding the award of credit toward an original sentence for any portion of time that a person is on probation or parole without violation, and how that would compute with good time. Mr. Chairman, I believe at least one speaker referenced, Judge Day referenced the staff comment on pages 19 and 20 of the bill draft. Also was a comment on page 22, lines 15 to 22, in terms of limiting the placement of a probationer into an intensive supervised program, limiting that to high risk based on the validated risk and need assessment. And then, Mr. Chairman, I believe Mr. Pelka mentioned in his presentation this morning an intent to also include language in the bill draft that would limit placement in a community corrections facility to those who are assessed as high risk under the validated risk and need assessment.
Mr. Chairman.
Representative Pelkey.
Motion to move the bill.
Moved by Pelkey, seconded by Hicks.
Mr. Chairman.
Representative Pelkey.
Motion to table the bill.
Okay.
Like squeeze it. Senator Nethercott's asking for an explanation. There are enough staff notes on here, enough recommended changes
And I've been here long enough to know that when you're writing in changes on a shoestring, trying to get out of here in an hour, that it's like squeezing a balloon. We may move something here and we'll have another problem pop up later. I'd like to spend a little bit more thoughtful time speaking with the stakeholders when we're not in session, and have all of us do that and try to make those changes work without damaging the bill in the long run. So that's my reason. That's been seconded, Mr. Chair.
Okay. You know, is there a parliamentarian in the room? Hey, Mr. Co-Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. That's kind of, Mr. Chairman, I guess my concern is recognizing a couple of things. One, that idea of if we give interested parties something to look at between now and the session, they have room to participate, and they may say we've almost got it, or where were you at? But if we have nothing, essentially the work that this committee has done and the many, many hours of testimony and interested parties around the state will be left with a balloon that's been popped. I think we ought to try and throw a few amendments on there and see if, and vote it up or vote it down, but give it a chance so that there's something to work with. If we don't do anything, if we let this bill die today, when the new committee is formed, basically you're taking all this work, setting it aside, and you're going to have to start over with a new committee with a whole new process and gathering new information around the state of Wyoming next year. Should we pick this up? And while it is there's a lot of strings in this ball that can be pulled on. This one has some real effect if we can.
Representative Winters.
Mr. Chairman, your co-chairman just said a lot of things that I was just thinking too, but based on also the conversation that we've had today, we may have been able to kind of tease out some of the answers that could really help this bill. And yes, there'll be a future time when other eyes will be looking at this, but I think it would be good to at least sharpen the vehicle we have now.
Senator Hicks.
Mr. Chairman, in my world, they call it inertia. And so we have spent a tremendous amount of time to try to move this ball just a little bit. And right now, to stop that, I think, is a mistake. And whether this ever makes it out of committee, what it fundamentally does is it keys up, it sets aside those issues that we can resolve between now and the time that it gets to committees and the legislature, and it puts, let's assume that it doesn't make it out of committee. It advances that process, fleshes out those issues, or if it doesn't make it through, for the next committee to start from a different point than where we would leave it if we would stop now. We've got some inertia here. Let's continue that inertia. And even if it fails, I think we will have advanced this down the road much further for the committee, whatever that committee looks like. So I think that's good advice that Chairman Christensen said, let's keep it going. So on and against the motion.
Yes. In my studies, I believe there's no discussion allowed on a motion to table, but the co-chairman held my feet to the fire on that, and we have discussed it. So anybody else want to weigh in? Representative Pennell.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We have done a lot of work on this bill, and several years it's been. So I think the table at this point would not be the right idea to go. I think we can, the way it looks right now, yeah, I believe we need some amendments, but I think we can work through that. We may not get all the amendments today. We can work through our committees if we have to. But I'm going to vote against tabling the bill. I think we need to continue with the bill.
Anybody else?
Question.
Question's been called for. All in favor of the motion to table, say aye. All opposed to the motion to table?
No.
No. Okay.
Overwhelming opposition.
On we go. So, are there any suggestions for amendments, Mr. Co-Chairman?
What was the
Mr. Chairman.
for and against on that?
I've got a couple little amendments. We could go ahead and do them. They're not necessarily in order by page is raised by LSO. If you want to go page by page, or you just want to take them as we bring them up. If you're ready for that, I'll go.
Well, I wrote down about 10 that they noted. So go ahead and pick one out and
Page 14.
we'll deal with those and then see if there's any more.
Mr. Chairman, on page 14, and this was one of the ones they raised, but on page 14, line 12, after the term compliance violation, put in a comma and add this language, a new violation of law or absconding. And then continue on with only after providing notice. So right after the word violation, we are compliance violation. We add a new violation of law or absconding. So.
Okay, moved by Christensen, second by Pelkey. Mr. Co-Chairman, any further comment?
One at a time. That's pretty clear.
Question on the amendment.
Okay, question on the amendment on page 14. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed, say no. Okay, that amendment passes.
Mr. Chairman,
Mr. Co-Chairman.
on page 15, line 10, after the word new, it'll read arrest for a new felony or offense. After the word new, add misdemeanor or. So it will then read an arrest for a new misdemeanor or felony.
Second.
Moved by Christensen, seconded by Hicks.
Question.
Any comment? Any question on the amendment? Okay. All in favor of that amendment on page 15, say aye. Aye. Opposed, say no. Amendment passes.
Mr. Chairman, on page 19, on page 19, line 6, after the statute reference 13-1802, new worded, provided, however, in the discretion of the probation agent, the agent may seek a probation revocation petition. Provided, however, in the discretion of the probation agent, the agent may seek a probation revocation petition.
Okay. Is there a second?
Second.
Seconded by Panel. Any more to be said, Mr. Co-Chairman, on your amendment?
No.
Any discussion on the amendment? Representative Stith.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Could you just explain the thought behind that, how this plays out in practice? Current language versus how it'll play out with the amendment.
Mr. Co-Chairman, when you're ready.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, it just gives them the opportunity to seek it. Doesn't say it's going to happen. It just opens the door for them to be able to seek a revocation if there's a problem or based on the violations. A little bit of room.
Representative Stith.
Mr. Chairman, I mean, that also implies that the probation agent or an entire probation office could just say, we're not going to mess with all this administrative sanctions. We're just going to seek revocation all the time. I mean, I guess what I'm asking, is there an example where you'd really want them to have the ability to just revoke this person? Are you thinking of someone who's been sanctioned like 4 times in a row and the probation officer just says, hey, administrative sanctions just aren't working? Is that the idea?
Mr. Chairman?
Mr. Co-Chairman.
Rather than myself start speculating, I'd probably invite either a judge or prosecutor up here if they think this has real value or if it answers any of the concerns that were expressed in earlier comments.
Okay. Or Mr. Causey, you're welcome to come, or Mr. Riedel, Judge Christensen, anybody who'd like to jump in, feel free.
Mr. Chairman, that was Mike Causey with the Board of Parole. Just to point out, you mentioned probation only. That section actually refers to both our probation, parole, as well as conditional release. So if we were going to do it for one, we'd probably need to do it for all, just to make sure.
And Mr. Chairman?
Mr. Co-Chairman.
I think in response to Representative Stith, does this add value to the critical issue, or am I being too generous.
No, Mr. Chairman, I think,
Yeah.
if I may, I believe that it does add some value. Not to kind of, I guess, get off point, one of the questions or one of the concerns that the members or some members have expressed regarding this piece of legislation or proposed legislation is that the sanction process essentially is going to remove that from board consideration. And this would kind of, I think, help in some ways to get that back if you do indeed have some sort of a repeat violations or those sorts of things. Whether or not that addresses all of the members' concerns, I do not know, but I would certainly visit with them and inform the committee once I determine that.
Senator Nethercott?
Mr. Chairman, thank you. I would just have concerns over putting all the discretion back in the probation agent, which I think might be contributing to our increased revocation numbers, then resulting in incarceration, particularly if in their own discretion they feel like it's appropriate to bring it back multiple times. And what I think the data indicates is that regardless of the significance of the underlying potential violations, if the judge sees the defendant 2 to 3 times on one of these revocation petitions, they're likely going to be incarcerated at that point because they just keep coming back as a frequent flyer, as used in the lingo. And that puts all of that decision making really in the hands of that probation agent at that point. And I'm not sure that that's solving the problem.
Hey, Mr. Edel. You might come on up so that the people online can hear you, Mr. Edel. You're welcome to do that.
Judge Christensen and I talked about this while you were discussing the matter, and for compliance, I think we're comfortable with not doing as the co-chair has indicated, unless it was the Department of Corrections that had some reason why they might want to see that in there, and we basically agree with Senator Nethercott on that on this matter as well.
Good, thank you. Any more discussion on the proposed amendment? Okay.
Should I withdraw?
Yes.
Let's call for a question on the amendment. All in favor? Yeah. All opposed? No. Okay, the amendment fails. Another suggestion for an amendment.
Mr. Chairman, can I try one more?
Sure, Mr. Co-Chairman.
Extinguisher down here.
No, he's tough.
Mr. Chairman, on page 22, bottom of page 22, on line 22, after probation, add provided, however, for good cause shown upon the record, the court may order that a defendant be placed in a program established under Wyoming Statute 7-13-1102.
Second.
Okay, moved by Christensen, seconded by Pinal. Any defense of your amendment,
Very
Mr.
good
Co-Chairman? Any discussion on the amendment?
Mr. Chairman, just a little explanation.
No.
Exactly what it does.
Mr. Co-Chairman. And then get somebody.
Mr. Chairman, when you look at the paragraph, it's pretty limiting. Shall not be placed in a program established unless they receive the validated risk assessment and scores as a high risk of reoffending or violations, conditions of probation. If you recall the example that our district court judge gave earlier in the day, when he ran into a risk assessment that took some pretty extreme circumstances, and based on the limitations of that tool, he was very limited in his options with a person who had an extremely long and egregious violent record. And so this just goes to answering that question so that the tool doesn't actually set us up for a bad outcome.
All right, there was somebody, Representative Pelkey, were you wanting to?
No, I'm fine.
Speak
I was
to
just
that
going to
one?
comment on your co-chairman's overwhelming sense of humility. I was just struck by that.
Okay. Anybody else want to discuss that amendment? Okay. Question's been called for. All in favor of the amendment, the bottom of page 22, say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, say no.
No.
The ayes have it. The amendment passes.
Hicks has been resurrected.
Any further suggestions for amendments?
Mr. Chairman.
Representative Winters.
Mr. Chairman, for sake of discussion, going back to page number 7, we heard some concern today from those involved in with county jails and sheriffs and things like that. And so I just like, I guess for the sake of discussion, to propose an amendment here that would place a new subsection under subsection 6. It would be, I guess, subsection 7, Romanet 7, that would say something along the lines of this: confinement under this section in a consenting Wyoming County jail shall be paid for by the department at the rate paid for confinement in a state penal institution.
Okay, been moved. And seconded by Olson.
Mr. Chairman, if I may offer a suggestion.
Certainly.
It may make more sense to place that language on page 10, somewhere in subsection E, which already discusses the cost of housing a probationer.
Mr. Co-Chairman.
Is it essentially already answered in paragraph E on page 10?
Not as it's currently stated.
All right.
Maybe we could ask Mr. Lampert.
Mr. Chairman,
Senator Hicks.
I think if we just followed staff's comment here and just adopted the existing language and just made that with replaces, I think in line 6, basically we would strike subsection E and then bring in that reference to 713-103 that language already exists in statutes, and it would be just uniform all the way through as far as it requires a negotiated cost at the county jails.
Mr. Chairman.
Okay, back to Representative Winters, who had an amendment on the table.
My
here.
motion hasn't been seconded yet, so I'll go ahead and
No,
withdraw that.
It was seconded.
Oh, it was.
By Olson.
Never mind.
Correct? Yep. So it's kind of in your court.
Mr. Chairman, I guess if I could change it, I guess, to adopt the language on the top of page 11 and insert that, the staff comment, it would address the concerns that I'm trying to raise with the previous motion. So if my second would be willing to adopt this as a friendly motion. All right.
Okay.
Love you too, sir. Yeah, so yes, sir, that's my new motion.
Okay, the staff comments now on the table as the proposed amendment. Senator Hicks.
Just our LSO staff would like to weigh
Mr.
in
Chairman,
on this.
just to
Okay.
clarify, Mr. Chairman, the language on lines 14, 15, and 16, we would delete that if we inserted it. So the sentence would end on line 14 after the department.
And you're back on page 7? Or are you?
Mr. Chairman, I'm referring to the staff comment.
The
on
staff comment.
Page 11.
Okay, and tell us again what you just said.
Mr. Chairman, to avoid any confusion with the language that's in current 713-103C, I believe the committee may want to consider, if adopting this subsection, to delete on line 14 after department the balance of the line, and then delete lines 15 and delete lines 16 through section. So just delete the rest of that sentence, and the sentence would end on line 14 after the department.
Okay.
Mr. Chairman?
Representative Winters.
Yes, sir, that's my motion.
Okay. Representative Stiff.
Mr. Chairman, I may just have a different printed out version of the bill, so I just got lost on the line numbers. If I understood what Mr. Fuller said, the idea is to adopt the top of page 11 and delete what?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Stith, I believe
Yeah,
the
Brian.
motion would delete the language, the subsection E, which is on the bottom of page 10.
10 lines 15 through 21.
That's, Mr. Chairman, Representative Stith, I believe that's what my understanding. And then
Thank
the
you.
language at the top of 11 would replace that.
Thank you.
Gotcha. That was helpful. Okay. Director Lampert.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Bob Lampert, Director of the Department of Corrections. We would have no objection to that. However, there is one qualifying statement that I'd like to have considered be added after on line 13 of the proposed amendment. At the county jail at an agreed per diem rate, and after agreed per diem rate, insert some of the language on page 10 that says, in effect, at a per diem rate not to exceed the amount established based on funds appropriated. I have no guarantee I'll continue to be here, and I don't want to tie the hands of any subsequent director in terms of being in a situation of having to pay for the placement in county jail if the funds aren't appropriated to do that. So I would just ask for that additional.
Okay. I think we're clear on what you're asking, and we're back to Representative Winters deciding whether he wants to include that.
Mr. Chairman, I'm tracking that in, and it looks like it is indeed a friendly amendment and would probably be necessary for the Department of Corrections for their fiscal bottom line. As to whether it's friendly or not, I'm not sure. What we're trying to make sure is that the counties are being paid, and that there's not a way for someone to get out of the obligation they would have. I would welcome conversation on the issue, I suppose.
Okay. Representative Pennell.
Currently, and I guess if I'm wrong, with the rate that is set now is $65 a day.
Right.
And that's set by, the legislators that have budgeted that amount to give to the corrections department. The sheriff does have, and this is used in split sentencing. The sheriff has the option to decline that, and it would say here upon an agreement. So if they don't want to take what the dollar amount that they're being offered, they can decline it and say they don't have to do it. So I think the amendment is a good amendment. I think that we've got to take the money that is available and not ask for the money.
Representative Stith.
So to implement what Representative Pownell just said, I would offer I move to amend the proposed amendment to add.
Mr. Chairman, point of order, I suppose. So we have an amendment, and then we have, we've already taken care of, I believe, the friendly amendment from LSO, but then we have another amendment to the amendment. And if we go three amendments down, we may have exceeded both Roberts and all the other.
And Elmo's rule, yes.
Yes, sir. And so I think he's raising a great point. So if we could maybe just take care of what's on the table now, and then come back around, unless it is a friendly amendment.
Okay. Representative Stith. what do
Mr.
you say
Chairman,
to that?
I think that's the purpose of my motion, is to take what Director Lampert said and turn that into a motion to amend. Oh, okay.
Okay. Well, what Representative Winters is saying, just take where we were with your original amendment and the LSO addition to that.
No, we had that, and then
We
what
had
Director Lampert was, and I just tracked it in, was he said after the word per diem rate not to exceed the amount established by, it basically adopts the language on the bottom of page 10 that would be stricken by the amendment, but readopt it and add that as a friendly amendment.
Okay.
So that right there is the proposal that I'm asking.
And you're
for as
good with
well.
all those multiple friendlies.
I am.
To bring
Yes,
us to that point.
I am.
Olson's over here considering it seriously, but he's good. Okay.
Mr. Chairman,
Senator Nethercott.
I have a question. I do not have an amendment. To the director, if I may. not knowing exactly how this funding is managed, is there a difference between what the per diem rate is that's appropriated for housing of offenders for those offenders that is there a difference of offenders for this particular budget allocation in your budget? So for example, asked another way, if you needed to, or if you wanted to, for the purposes of understanding what we're doing here for criminal justice reinvestment, negotiate or have to negotiate in different counties, perhaps something higher than the per diem rate, instead of boxing yourself into what the legislature maybe tells you for all per diems for all offenders, if there's any ability to alter that in any way, and just want to make sure that we're not tying the hands in both directions of either yourself or future directors.
Mr. Chairman,
Please.
Senator Nethercott, at the current time, let's use, well, I'm trying to think of a good example. Let's use a contracted bed as an example of, we have a certain level of appropriation and we live within that appropriation. We can either hold firm to the daily rate, which controls the numbers. In order to increase the numbers with that appropriation, we would have to decrease the daily rate. At the other end of that is, if we wanted to put more people in county jail at a higher rate negotiated, that just means that we would have less funds available for more placements, if that makes sense. What I'm trying to say is that we live within the appropriation that we have. This would give the ability to negotiate within that appropriated range for these placements. That wouldn't necessarily affect existing contracts in terms of how much we pay for ACCs or other placements.
Senator.
Real quick question, and I guess when I look at this, is I do think it ties the hands of both parties to a rate that might in the future constrain your ability to actually do. So let's deal with the hypothetical that you may have the ability to do this with someplace in far remote corners of Wyoming, and it would actually be cheaper for you to pay that rate at the county jail than all the transportation costs to move the inmates back and forth. I don't see by adding that we gain anything, because you know what you already have. It's negotiated. And if you say this is all I'm going to pay, that's all you're going to pay. Same with the county sheriff. So I think this actually starts to put constraints on you and the sheriff on what that price is going to be. So I'm just curious, am I reading that wrong by saying, you know what your level is based on your budget? You can say, I can't pay that, county sheriff. We don't need to put that in statute. I guess the question I have is I think that creates down the road potential constraints on your flexibility. You may be down to just $5 a day. Is that not better to do that in the county jail or not, given the remote location and the other ancillary cost of transporting inmates around the state? So I don't know. I think you already have the flexibility in there to do that. But.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Hicks,
Director.
this language actually comes from other existing statute. And I don't remember if it's sanctions statute or where, and Mr. Lindley can certainly probably clarify that. All I'm trying to say is, from my perspective, that it actually gives permission to negotiate within the funding that we have. If we go in just with a clear, you can negotiate, period, there, at least from the sheriff's perspective, if I was a sheriff, I'd say there's no limitation on how much I can charge. I can charge, my daily rate plus the vacancy rate and hire new staff or whatever. So although that's a negotiated rate, it also gives some incentive to maximizing the rate for the sheriffs if we don't have any limitations. So that's my perspective. Mr. Lindley, do you have any clarification?
No.
Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Riedel?
Mr. Chair,
having adopted LSO's recommendation of including essentially the first 3 lines of 713-103, and wearing my hat as the civil legal advisor for the Board of County Commissioners and the Sheriff of Sheridan County, I wonder if we shouldn't also include the language beginning on line 16, page 11, that requires the department to pay for any medical treatment of the prisoner other than for conditions demanding immediate medical attention, which can be treated at the county jail, and other than medical treatment for which the county is liable under 186303C1, Romanet 1, period. And the reason for that is that there's currently a cap, for instance, under the split sentencing statute, on what the counties are obligated to pay with respect to medical expenses. Some of those can get shifted back to Department of Corrections. Some of them the prisoner is responsible for, and it's those sorts of injuries that are sustained by the prisoner while in custody that the county's on the hook for. And I don't know that the county wants to assume that counties generally would want to assume additional liability in that respect.
Mr. Chairman.
Representative Winters.
Mr. Chairman, as the amendment currently stands, that language is actually part of. So we basically placed a period on line 14 at after the word department. Then we pick back up the amendment at line 16, starting with the words, "The department shall pay for any medical treatment of the prisoner." So I believe it currently is in there.
Is that okay?
Okay. Thank you. All right. Any further discussion on that amendment?
Question.
Question been called for. All in favor of the amendment on pages 10 and 11, say aye. Aye. Opposed, say no. Amendment passes. Okay, I would remind us all as we continue to discuss these things, get close to your mic so we can be heard. Any further suggestions? We have, well, I've got Senator Anselmi Dalton and then Representative Pennell.
Thank you, Chairman. This is one that was proposed by CSG on page 22, and I'm not going to be very artful because I don't know what the terminology should be, but on line 19 after WS 7-13-1102 to add "and ACCs," their comment was that the policy option intended the same policy to apply to ACC admissions, but it doesn't appear in the bill. So I'm just trying to pick up their comment.
Second.
Okay, moved by Anselmi Dalton, seconded by Pelkey. Any more you wish to explain? Anyone want to discuss that amendment? Mr. Co-Chairman.
It's going to read it shall not replace.
Unless they're high risk. Or they're deemed.
Okay. Good with that. Mr. Pelka, were you rising to contribute there?
Sorry. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Marc Pelka from the Council of State Governments. And as Senator Anselmi Dalton mentioned, the intention for the policy option was indeed for the ISP policy on page 22, line 6, all the way to the end, to apply also to ACCs. And upon realizing my error in assisting LSO after the last working group meeting, I did come in with some draft language that would apply that to this policy to the ACCs. Since then, the amendment was accepted to the ISP to allow courts and to still place people into ISP if there is good cause in that. So if there was support from the committee in applying language to mirror ISP policy toward ACC policy and incorporate the amendment to allow the additional discretion that would fulfill our vision with the policy option. I'm not sure what the protocol is to furnish the senator with the draft language that we prepared. I'd be happy to do that unless you might already have it. Okay. Okay.
Mr.
Thank you,
Chairman, if
Senator.
we could just clarify what you handed us earlier, Mark.
Oh, sure. Yes. What I handed LSO early, Mr. Chairman, what I handed LSO earlier in the day was essentially the on page 22, line 10, the kind of red underscored language, who was assessed through a validated risk need assessment as a high risk for reoffending or violating a condition of parole. And I simply applied that language to ACC as well as some of the conditions. I don't have I handed my only copy. I'm not sure what the protocol is. I'm happy to do whatever I can.
Mr. Chairman,
Senator.
if I could have the LSO staff explain how they think this has to be amended, because I just saw this language myself that they're handing me.
Okay, I found I'm sorry, Mr. Chairman, I found a copy of it.
Okay.
So, however, it applies a statute that's not in the bill. I'm sorry, Mr. Chairman, so I'm not sure how, if it doesn't work out, I understand, but.
Okay, Brian?
Mr. Chairman, I'll try to keep this as simple as
Pardon me?
possible because this language is not in the bill draft, but the amendment would be to insert, it would be page 25 after line 8. It would be to insert 718.115B. Subsection G is currently in the draft. So it would insert B, and the intro reads, placement of a parolee in an adult community correctional facility or program under this section shall be made only if, and it would create a paragraph 5, which would read, the offender is assessed through a validated risk need assessment as a high risk for reoffending or violating a condition of probation.
Okay, so you said subsection B originally, and then paragraph 5, what?
It would create, Mr. Chairman, it would create a new paragraph 5.
Okay.
And then, Mr. Chairman, there would also need to be an amendment to 718.108B, which would be inserted on page 24 after line 18. And that would read, the B intro reads, placement of an offender in an adult community correctional facility or program under this section shall be made only if, and it would create a new paragraph 4, which would read, the offender is assessed through a validated risk need assessment as a high risk for reoffending or violating a condition of probation.
Okay.
Then, Mr. Chairman, one more change. At the end of the bill, on page 25, excuse me, line 19, or excuse me, it'd be on line 20, we would add 718.115B1. And B1, Mr. Chairman, if it's left in, reads, placement of a parolee shall be made only if the State Board of Parole determines the inmate poses a low risk of escape or violence, which I believe would be inconsistent with the new language proposed by this amendment.
Okay. So, and all this would be in place of what Senator Anselmi Dalton originally proposed on page 22?
Mr. Chairman, that's correct.
Yes. Okay. Mr. Co-Chairman.
Chairman, Brian, since we have previously amended paragraph D on 22 with that language for the court, does that need to track into any of these new paragraphs?
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Co-Chairman, I believe that'd be up to the committee.
Be consistent. It needs to track over, doesn't it?
That language there.
I'd consider that friendly amendment to my lengthy amendment that was kind of short to begin with.
It's all right. Take a moment. Did you still have your hand up? Or was it? Oh, okay. So you will.
Yeah,
Okay.
Chairman?
Mr. Chairman, I believe that would work out
Okay.
to insert language similar to that.
Correct. So the new addition, you will be able to massage it in as appropriate. Language.
Let us have another minute because I'm not sure we're on the same page here. We're talking about the amendment on page 22 to 713 1105D, which added the language, provided, however, that for good cause in the record, a defendant may be placed in a program established under Wyoming statute 713 1102. This is, and I guess what we're struggling with right now is that pertains to probation. And I believe, and this is what I need to clarify, that this statute applies to parolees. So I don't know that that.
So 108 applies to a placed on an offender.
Mr. Chairman?
Senator?
While we wait for them to look at it real quickly, Mr. Chairman, I just wanted to note again that on slide 30, that Mr. Pelka showed us that only 5% of the ACC beds statewide were used to treat recidivism. That's what I'm just trying to pull this language in so that when we come back in the session, we'll have time to assess, what we should do with ACCs as well as ISPs. I know it's kind of complicated, but I'm hoping we could just put it as a placeholder for now so that we can have more chance to look at it and have the public be able to weigh in as well.
Okay, thank you.
And slide 31. Thank you.
Representative Stith.
Mr. Chairman, just if I understand just the broader overall context, we had a presentation from CSG which seemed to say that we're not utilizing our adult correctional community centers the way we should because we've got this bad mix of low risk and high risk offenders. It's their recommendation that we put the high risk offenders in the ACCs. I think it was the policy recommendation. And if I understand the purpose of this proposed amendment, it is to accomplish that. Is that the idea?
Nicely put.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Co-Chairman.
I'd certainly be comfortable with allowing staff to work on that clarification if this is appropriate. Time to really.
And Mr.
That new language.
Okay.
On the 22, allow them to do the right thing.
Thank you,
All right.
Mr. Chairman. And I do think that we've come to at least a temporary conclusion that it is appropriate for 718-108.
So Senator Anselmi Dalton has an amendment on the table. Any further discussion? Question been called. All in favor of the amendment, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, say no.
No.
Okay, the ayes have it. Amendment is adopted. Representative Pennell.
Mine, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Question on page 9, number 19 through 21. I know it was brought to our attention that basically somebody that was put in a compliance violation who was incarcerated, and that was going to be credited towards their days for release. I'm wondering if that's what we really wanted to do or not, and I just wanted to bring it back to the attention of the committee.
Mr. Chairman,
Senator Nethercott.
we maybe direct that question to LSO. There might be a constitutional requirement to do that.
Okay, that sounds like a good idea.
Mr. Chairman, just to clarify, the language on page 9, and Mr. Chairman, Representative Pennell, I hope I heard correctly, the language on lines 27 to 30.
No.
No.
19 through 21.
Mr. Chairman, if I can help.
Senator?
The question, Representative Ponnell asked the committee for us to review that particular section, if that's what we really intended to do. I asked LSO to provide direction of whether or not we're required to do that under the Constitution, just to provide some less legal direction as to whether or not that's really optional or not.
So I guess, Mr. Chairman, I would maybe reframe the question. Romanet 1 says all time in custody related to the compliance violation shall be credited towards the probationer's sentence. I don't think that that's necessarily constitutionally required. And I'm sorry, I can't come up with the scenario off the top of my head, but I think that if a person is held in custody on a new charge, perhaps this is the scenario, and it also constitutes a basis for a later probation violation, that doesn't necessarily, unless that probation violation held them in custody. So it's really a question of what the sheriff has as the hold on a person. So if they're brought in on a $10,000 bond for a new offense and they're held on that, and then 2 weeks later, the probation officer files a probation violation, it may not be constitutionally required that they get credit for that. If they are being held on that probation violation, then I think, and again, this is off the top of my head, I believe that they're required to get that credit.
Okay, Director Lampert.
Mr. Chairman, Bob Lampert, Director of the Department of Corrections, and consulting with Mr. Lindley and in hearing from the Parole Board, we do currently, by practice, grant that time towards a sentence if they're in custody. So this would reinforce that practice.
Okay. Anyone else out there? Okay, we didn't have an amendment. We were just dealing with the question on page 9, lines 19 through 21. So if that's taken care of, are there other suggestions for amendments to the bill? No, just
Question.
let's wait just a moment. Did we have we taken care of all those, I guess, are all the ones we want to take care of? Mr. Fuller originally mentioned there was about 10 different pages that had notes on them. Okay. Any further amendments? If not, question on the bill has been called for. So, Mr. Fuller, if you'd call the roll.
Mr. Chairman, this would be a vote for the committee to sponsor 19 LSO 230 as amended. Senator Anselmi Dalton. Aye. Senator Hicks.
Aye.
Senator Nethercott. Aye. Representative Jennings.
Aye.
Representative Olson.
Aye.
Representative Pelkey.
Aye.
Representative Pennell.
Aye.
Representative Salazar.
Out of the room at the moment.
Representative Stith.
Aye.
Representative Winters. Aye. Chairman Christensen.
For my last official judiciary vote, aye.
Representative Salazar. Aye. Chairman Kirkbride.
Aye.
Mr. Chairman, the motion passes.
Okay, bill passes 4-0 and 8-0 in the respective houses. So that brings us to the end of the trail for today. Staff, is there anything else we need to consider?
Mr. Chairman, I'm not sure if the chairman wished to divide the bills among whether they're going to be House bills or Senate files at this time.
You know, I would suggest, Mr. Co-Chairman, we don't do that right now and call one another and discuss that in a week or two. Talking about dividing the bills as to which will be House and which will be Senate.
Mr. Chairman, I think 45 minutes, we could get her handled.
Well, it's tempting, I admit, but
We can do it in a phone call next week.
I think we'll wait on that, Brian. Okay. All right. Thank you once again, public, for bearing with us all these meetings. And today in particular, it's been great working with the committees. Did you have something, sir? You know, we're about to wrap up. Yeah. Well, you could hand it out to us and we'll submit it to our attorneys and it'll be included in the record. If that's okay. That's me. Okay, thank you. Meeting adjourned.